I thank you most kindly for the invitation to be with you tonight, and I thank you to all who participated in organizing this amazing book tour. I am truly grateful. My topic is the authentic Fethullah Gülen, how the Hizmet movement he inspired offers a hopeful alternative to religious nationalism and the backlash to globalization. Take us through a brief attempt at levity, and then raise a series of questions. Who is Fethullah Gülen? What is our context? Why did I write this book? I'll then outline the book for you, including reading from a section of each chapter. I hope by my conclusion, which will be the final pages of the biography, you will recognize the Hizmet movement, inspired by Fethullah Gülen, as a hopeful alternative to religious nationalism and the backlash to globalism. Sound good? Okay. An attempt at levity. Saint Julian of Norwich, a 14th century anchorite nun, once said, "The way to fight evil isn't to cudgel the brain, but to lead a life of love and laughter." So we'll try to laugh, or at least smile a little bit, through three pretty bad jokes. First, a mommy joke, based on my family's immigration experience from Germany to America in steerage. Mami, ich will nicht in die Vereinigten Staaten. Sei ruhig und schwimm weiter. Okay, a little anyway. Sorry. She is. Second, a little Fritz joke. My father's nickname as a child was Fritz. His name was Fred. Lehrer, wo wurde der Friedensvertrag von 1555 unterschrieben? Unten rechts. Finally, a Black Sea joke. Was passiert mit einem roten Stein, der ins Schwarze Meer fällt? Er wird nass. Okay. Getting serious. My mentor at the University of Chicago introduced me to his favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, who will give us our starting point for this evening. I would like to beg you, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. We'll begin then with some questions. There he is. Who is Fethullah Gülen? That question begins to get an answer if we simply study where he lived in Turkey during his years there. He was born in Korucuk, in a tiny and poor village near Erzurum, in Turkey's northeastern corner. He then served his first appointment as a preacher in Edirne, in the far northeast, Thrace. Mandatory military service took him to the capital of Ankara and elsewhere, and he then served mosques in Izmir, around the Aegean region, and in Istanbul for the remainder of his years as a preacher. Since 1999, as is well known, he has lived at the Golden Generation Retreat Center in Pennsylvania, where he continues to teach, preach, and write as his health permits. Fethullah was the second child of 8 of Ramiz and Rafia Gülen, who gave birth to him in 1938. By all accounts, including his own, the Gülens were a happy family. His father, Ramiz, was an imam. Rafia was a Quran teacher, including to her son, and also, at some risk, she taught the Quran to women in her community at a time when the government was closely monitoring all religious communication, as our keynoter communicated. Gülen went to public schools only through 2nd grade, after which he studied Sufism and Islamic theology in madrasas in and near Erzurum, preparing to follow in his father's footsteps and become a preacher. In 1958, at age 20, he realized that aim, being called to serve as a preacher in a tiny mosque in Edirne, a Greek-influenced city in the province of Thrace. Edirne had a reputation for being a secularist stronghold, and Gülen quickly discovered that he could not, quote, preach Erzurum in Edirne, as he put it. His service as a preacher was interrupted in 1961 by mandatory military service required of all Turkish young men. He served for 2 years, mostly as a radio operator, mostly in Ankara, while continuing to preach as a guest in various mosques. It was during his military service that he first ran into trouble with secular authorities, who were on edge following the 1960 military coup. Despite these difficulties, which led to a brief leave of absence for health reasons, the years were fruitful for him. At the recommendation of one of his commanders, Gülen began studying Western philosophy, science, literature, and music, expanding the range of his understanding beyond only Islamic sources. Immanuel Kant was a particular influence. Gülen completed his military service in 1963, and when he returned to his call in Edirne, he moved into increasingly important pulpits, drawing large crowds. This again drew the attention of the secular authorities, and in 1964 he was arrested and charged with undermining the secularism of the Turkish Republic. He endured a trial, but was found not guilty and released. He then served briefly in a mosque in Kirklareli, also in Thrace, before being appointed in 1966 as a Quran teacher and preacher at Kastana Pazara School and Mosque in Izmir. Yeah. It was in Izmir that something identifiable as the Hizmet community began to develop. Gülen was worried about the setting. Izmir was cosmopolitan and perhaps even more secular than Edirne. "I will drown there," said the young man from Korajuk. Instead, he flourished, meeting with Jewish and Christian leaders, building bridges with political figures, police, and business leaders. Those business leaders began raising funds on Gülen's council to open and eventually build dersanes, dormitories, for students coming to Izmir's many universities from the Anatolian countryside. The dersanes proved attractive to Muslim parents as a way to help their youth transition from rural to city living, and they soon multiplied all over Turkey. Gülen also began holding summer camps for youth, a popular practice in many contexts, but not typical in Turkey. His sermons, often for weeks at a time on a single theme, such as faith or fasting or women, for just a few examples, would be advertised in advance, and the mosque would be full to overflowing. Friends also began recording the sermons and circulating them widely. Such attention once again riled the secular authorities, and following the so-called coup by memorandum in 1971, Gülen was arrested and jailed for 6 months when he was released in a general amnesty. Following his release, Gülen began a kind of itinerancy that would mark the remainder of his years in Turkey. He took pulpits in Manisa and Bornova, Izmir suburbs, but also traveled all over the Aegean teaching, preaching, and organizing business leaders, a pattern that eventually became nationwide. In 1977, he made his first international trip to Germany, where he spoke with the growing Turkish communities in Berlin, Hamburg, Köln, and other venues. Following another military coup, following another military coup in 1980, Gülen was prohibited from preaching for 6 years and was under constant surveillance at his flat in Istanbul, where he had moved. He also, however, had made friends in high places, and so when a raid was coming, he could be warned and would escape down the back stairs to go to a safe house in Erzurum or Istanbul or Antalya. By trying to silence Gülen, the government ironically spread Hizmet. As he visited diverse cities, he shared the patterns of thought linking Orthodox Islam and progressive modernity. And people in these venues began multiple initiatives in education and business to generate wealth for social causes. It was during these years that the first schools in Yamanlar in Izmir and Fatih in Istanbul began, led by trustees and organized around foundations of volunteers responsible for their governance. The schools followed a secular curriculum, and they emphasized especially science and mathematics, areas where Gülen was convinced Muslims had fallen behind the rest of the world. In 1986, Gülen, once again, was allowed to take the pulpit, and he began a pattern of preaching usually twice a week, once in Istanbul and once in Izmir. He preached for over a year on the topic of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions. By then, Hizmet had begun tutoring centers to help students do well in the Turkish college entrance exam, which became a significant source of revenue for the movement. And schools continued to be built at a rapid pace, first in Turkey, then in the Turkic-speaking countries of the former Soviet Union, and by the 1990s all over the world, including every continent. At the same time, the range of social businesses, begun by people inspired by Gülen, multiplied to include every range of human enterprise, especially media, construction, IT, think tanks, and disaster relief. And Gülen intensified his outreach and interreligious dialogue, welcoming the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel to Istanbul, meeting regularly with Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew I, and eventually making a pilgrimage to Rome to meet with Pope Jon Paul II. Yet another government crackdown, following the so-called postmodern coup in 1997, led to further scrutiny of Gülen and Hizmet, eventually resolving to much sound and fury, signifying nothing. By this time, Gülen was also experiencing health challenges, notably diabetes and heart disease. In 1999, he followed his cardiac surgeon to the United States, taking up residence at a former summer camp, now a retreat center, about 2 hours north of Philadelphia in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania. Hizmet continued to grow all over the globe and in Turkey down to 2013. In that year, a corruption inquiry cut very close to Prime Minister at the time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and at his directive, the inquiry was cut short, and Erdogan's government began to turn on Gülen and Hizmet, seeing them as a threat to Erdogan's increasingly authoritarian ambitions. Governmental repression of Hizmet grew through a series of incidents in 2014 and 15, finally culminating in a theatrical but bloody failed coup attempt on July 15th, 2016, which unleashed an unprecedented purge of anyone even suspected or accused of being close to Gülen, who was now labeled a terrorist. Since 2016, Gülen and the Hizmet community have been traumatized, to be sure, but also show once again signs of resilience that mirror what happened after every previous government attempt to silence the movement. Gülen's own health is fragile, but he continues to teach students and welcome guests at the retreat center as his health permits. Now, that quick overview obviously raises as many questions as it answers. Why did the government hate him so? I believe to live into that question, we must take a big step back from the messiness of Turkish politics to understand global dynamics that have characterized the past century or so. Asking another question, what is our context? I am persuaded by an argument of the Harvard neuropsychiatrist Steven Pinker that we live, until recently at least, with the tragic war crimes by Russia in Ukraine, we live in the most peaceful era of human history ever. Life expectancies have risen, infant mortality rates dropped, extreme poverty has been reduced, and we live with creature comforts unimaginable to my German ancestors who emigrated to America from Prussia in the late 19th century. This long peace, see Immanuel Kant's 1793 essay on perpetual peace, this long peace follows from three developments that Pinker tracks. First, the emergence of stable nation states where people have a voice and where violence is checked by the rule of law. Second, globalized trade networks, because peoples who trade with each other tend not to go to war with each other, war being notoriously bad for trade, as we have experienced over the past year. And third, peace follows from the formation of and participation by peoples in international agencies and organizations such as the UN. Pinker, unfortunately, fails to see that by far the most durable and robust of our international organizations are not secular political organizations. In fact, the most durable and robust of our international organizations are our religious traditions. I'll return to that insight shortly. Simultaneously with the emergence of this long and global peace, however, is the emergence of what sociologist Mark Jorgensmeyer first identified as religious nationalism, or more recently as religious violence, in patterns cutting across nations and cultures. I believe we can most effectively understand this rise of religious nationalisms as backlash to pluralism and globalization, much as historian Tara Zara from Stanford documents occurred between World War I and II here in Europe in a book that I highly recommend. Our context then, grossly simplified, is of a dynamic and growing global network of cultural exchange, not only trade, and growing respect for pluralism, facilitated both by easy travel and by technologies such as the internet and social media. Converging majorities, and simultaneously a backlash against globalization and pluralism in the form of religious nationalisms, clashing minorities. I believe these religious nationalisms are based upon a big lie, or perhaps a big distortion, The idea that a single religious unanimity is necessary to undergird any society, an impossibility in any event. The historical forces that have led to the unprecedented persecution of Gülen and people of Hizmet in Turkey, in other words, are similar to forces shared in widely diverse settings around the globe, such as Israel, Russia, India, and the United States, for example. We have seen these patterns, this reliance upon the big lie before, as Orwell so accurately depicted, quote, "And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past," ran the party's slogan, "controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," end quote. And precisely because these settings are so different, Turkey, Israel, Russia, India, the United States, and more, and yet find a common cause, I find reason for hope. We are dealing with cultural systems, and cultural systems can be changed, improved, advanced. They are humanly constructed. A change in one place can lead to changes in others. As Bishop Desmond Tutu once put it, when people decide they want to be free, nothing can stop them. And at the heart of change on behalf of freedom must be how our religious traditions interact. To paraphrase an insight from the late Swiss theologian Hans Kühn, if religion is part of the problem, it must be part of the solution. Or as he actually put it more elegantly than I, no peace among the nations without peace among the religions, no peace among the religions without dialogue among the religions. I believe the people committed to growing peace between our religious traditions constitutes the vast majority of believers around the globe. Those misusing religion for narrow, nationalist political purposes, so-called strong men, are a dwindling but fierce minority of people pulled to reaction and backlash. I'll return to this point in my conclusion. I wrote my biography of Fethullah Gülen then, first of all, to answer the question, how could a single individual both inspire a global movement and inspire such fierce hatred? I suppose as a Christian, I should not have been surprised by this conjunction of love and fear. Peace builders often find their ways strewn with obstacles, but I was. A growing part of my motivation then, aside from the obvious historical task of objectively uncovering evidence and narrating it as accurately and clearly as possible, an increasing part of my motivation became to counter the big lie that has tarred Gülen as a leader of a global terrorist organization, FETO. That lie was built on several others which had circulated for years, namely that Hizmet was part of a parallel deep state within Turkey, and that Hizmet was a cult. Neither is accurate, which is also true of the big lie that Gülen and Hizmet were responsible for the botched July 15 coup attempt. Were there Hizmet individuals who, following orders, participated in the coup attempt? No doubt. But to believe that Gülen and people of Hizmet would undermine 40 years of patient, müspet hareket, positive action by embracing violence simply makes no sense. And even more, it contradicts the evidence. The one man who did have at his fingertips the control of the military was not an elderly scholar in Pennsylvania with limited computer skills, but the man who is now President of the Republic, Erdogan. And again, the purge of Hizmet civil servants began well before July 15th in a series of human rights violations that accelerated rapidly the very day after it. Consequently, I have sought increasingly to be intentionally corrective, to counter the big lie, and to clarify that the authentic Fethullah Gülen is a man of peace. He is a teacher and scholar who has inspired the non-violent Hizmet community of volunteers to work for what I call deep peace, which is at the core to foster trust. Fethullah Gülen's historical significance is that he taught people to trust themselves as Muslims active in civil society. That trust grew into a movement that became a threat to a politician's increasingly dictatorial ambitions. And that dictator has targeted the movement since 2013 by a concerted and very well-funded campaign of misinformation, slander, and violence, including firings, arrests, passport seizures, imprisonments, closing of military outlets, seizure of corporate and personal assets to the equivalent of billions of dollars, and other human rights violations. I have taken as my guide then the 8th commandment of the Christian tradition: do not bear false witness, and in particular its articulation by Martin Luther in his small catechism, which I memorized as a child and still try to live by as a scholar. We should fear and love God, that we may not deceitfully belie, betray, or slander, or defame our neighbor, but defend them, speak well of them, and put the best construction on everything." End quote. Let me assert also, however, that putting the best construction on everything in no way compromises my commitment to evaluating critically the evidence, all of the evidence about the life of Gülen and the Hizmet movement. I had no interest in writing a hagiography, and I believe I avoided that temptation. I'm a sympathetic outsider or a critical friend of the movement. What I mean then by asserting that Gülen and people of Hizmet promote deep peace can be clarified by what I call the peace-growing garden. Peace is simply the capacity of people to flourish. Peace is not a utopian dream, but peace is in fact the lived experience of people every day as they grow as human beings, more or less. Religions especially contribute to peace organically more than strategically. But peace can also be differentiated. I call basic peace the absence of war or other arbitrary violence. It is often called negative peace in peace studies because the absence of arbitrary violence under the rule of law is the most basic requirement for human flourishing, for having a voice and agency in how one lives. Policy peace, then, is generated through political and economic relations and is marked by the absence of gross inequality and by fair access to resources such as food, water, shelter, energy, healthcare, education, all those resources that promote sustainability and flourishing. In a word, policy peace is justice, realized again, more or less, in any society. Finally, deep peace is trust. And deep peace is generated through literacy, through nonviolent practices such as prayer, through engaged empathy, through principled pluralism, and social enterprises. I'll say more about each of these 5 topics as they are the topics of the 5 chapters in the biography. In other words, I organized the biography both chronologically and topically. tracing the course of Gülen's life and tracing how he is a man of peace by advocating for literacy, nonviolent practices, engaged empathy, principled pluralism, and social enterprises. And the irony of history is that it is exactly because Gülen and the movement trusted what Erdogan said when he came to power that has now made Hizmet a useful scapegoat for the dictator. Erdogan promised to advance egalitarianism in Turkey. He's proved instead to be a kleptocrat in the Putin model. Erdogan promised to advance Turkey's candidacy for EU membership. He's proved to be a religious nationalist. Erdogan promised to promote democracy in Turkey. He's proved to be a dictator by shutting down media outlets and stifling civil society. Erdogan knew Hizmet would not hit back, so he hit them. In a phrase repeatedly offered by Gülen to his friends, even in these exceptionally difficult times, quote, "We must be as handless to those who hit us, tongueless to those who curse us, forgiving everything that is forgivable. If they fracture us into pieces, still we are going to remain unbroken and embrace everyone with love and compassion. And with love toward one another, we will walk toward tomorrow." End quote. For the remainder of my talk, prior to taking your questions, and I look forward to them very much, I'll walk you through the 5 chapters of the book, reading brief excerpts to build my case that the authentic Fethullah Gülen is a man of peace. Chapter 1, then, learning, covers his upbringing in the Erzurum region, his first call to Edirne, and then traces the significance of the educational initiative started by Hizmet around the globe, focusing especially on schools in Iraq and the Kurdish regions of southern Turkey. A central metaphor can characterize the educational initiatives of Gülen and Hizmet, drawing from the teachings of Said Nursi, whose Risale-i-Nur he encountered in the early 1950s. Gülen has encouraged people to fly with 2 wings. That is, to learn to unite science and spirituality. Reflecting on his own education in the madrasa, Gülen wrote that, quote, "I early noticed that the madrasa did not have a modern line of rationale, a mathematical foundation, or at least a root in Baconian logic," end quote. The result was that the madrasa, quote, "estranged the natural sciences and research, despite injunctions in the Quran and Sunnah. While God says, we will show them our manifest signs in the horizons of the universe and within our own selves, we hardly saw research, examinations, and engagement with the nature of things. Although the Quran was read, the book of nature was left to the side. A clash emerged in the society, and the mind was separated from the heart." End quote. So uniting mind and heart, science and spirituality, is what it means to fly with 2 wings. And this drive for unity across disciplines is at the heart of Hizmet's educational enterprises. A school is a kind of sacred place, Gülen has said. And the movement, of course, has built thousands of tutoring centers, dormitories, primary and secondary schools, colleges and universities on every continent. People of Hizmet have attended, and some now teach at, the world's most prestigious universities. Through education, Gülen and people of Hizmet have fostered the literacy that grows trust, that grows deep peace. Chapter 2, We Were Young, traces Gülen's years in Izmir at Kastanapazara School and Mosque, which is where the Hizmet movement really took root. The chapter is structured around the 5 pillars of Islam: confession, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, and charity, and traces Gülen's teaching on each of these 5 topics, while also tracking his growth and development. What began to emerge as he built relations with business and public leaders in Izmir was what we can call civil Islam, as opposed to political Islam. If political Islam seeks to use political party organizing to foster Islamic societies from the top down, Civil Islam seeks to form faithful Muslim individuals who then contribute to civil society through their diverse vocations from the bottom up. That is, Gülen saw the formation of individuals through nonviolent practices like prayer as the crucial first step toward peace in a Turkey that was terribly divided by political factions. Working especially with youth, Gülen brought back from his first pilgrimage to Mecca the conviction that as a Muslim, he was a citizen of the world. He was above all a servant of God. And that meant, as he once put it, that to go from one place where there is Hizmet to a place where there is no Hizmet, to create Hizmet, is to do pilgrimage. End quote. Pilgrimage, then, was not just tied to a specific place. It was what one did with the pilgrimage that mattered. Gülen had noted that many young men didn't go to the mosques, but spent a lot of time in coffee houses playing cards and backgammon. Some things don't change. So he suggested to his friends that they go to coffee houses. One of these friends was Yusuf Pekmezci, who died in jail last year. Pekmezci recalled in an interview that he tried to dissuade Gülen. "That's a really bad idea," he remembered saying. "People smoke there, they play cards. People will ask, 'What's a Hoja doing in a coffee house?'" Gülen acknowledged the concerns, but then said, "You're worried about what people will think. My concern is what God thinks. The prophets went to the people. The people didn't listen. They derided them. They did bad things to them, but no prophet gave up on going to them. We need to give our respect to these people because they too are created by God. Nobody is greater than another. What we know, we must share. If they ask, and we know, we'll explain, and we might have things to learn from them." End quote. So they went to the coffee house. And eventually these meetings spread to dozens of coffee houses in Izmir and the Aegean. A pilgrimage to Mecca became a repeated pilgrimage to take Hizmet where there is no Hizmet. That was only one of the nonviolent practices that Gülen began reviving and reinterpreting during his years in Izmir. Collectively, the spiritual practices at the heart of Islam generate deep peace, as they did for people inspired by Gülen as they prayed, fasted, gave charity, went on pilgrimage, and trusted in God and in one another. Chapter 3, Empathy and Tears, 1971 to 1980, documents the rapid growth of Hizmet as Gülen's fame as a creative teacher and powerful preacher grew throughout Turkey, and especially in the Aegean region. His preaching was marked by both scholarly precision and intense emotion. He would often cry, as our keynoter said during a sermon, and frequently the entire congregation would start crying with him. He became known, in fact, as the crying Hoja. At first, this struck me as very odd, perhaps even manipulative. But Ezra Koshar offered me in an interview one of the best explanations. She grew up in Ankara and learned of Gülen through audio tapes of his sermons that he delivered in mosques around the Aegean. "I was wondering," she asked, "why was he crying?" Over the years, Koshar worked it out. Quote, "Eventually it became easy for me to understand. He was crying over the situation of Islam in the world. We are behind in every subject. As humans, we are failing God by not being servants of God." End quote. Hoja Efendi's tears signal a deficit in Hizmet. To further explain, Koshar recalled a teacher she knew in Ankara. This teacher, quote, "was filled with hatred. Unlike her," she continued, "Hoja Efendi was not angry, but his sermons were filled with compassion and love." End quote. Her evidence to support this assertion was that Gülen's tears stemmed from and encouraged self-critical awareness. Quote, "Look at ourselves," she paraphrased Gülen. "And rather than being angry with people around us, rather than blaming others, look at ourselves. Why are we here?" End quote. That positive approach, living the questions, as Rilke put it, gave Koshar hope to live a life of purpose through Hizmet. Gülen's tears were poetry without words, as he himself put it. In 1997, Gülen made his, In 1997, Gülen made his first trip to Europe, to Germany. He preached on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, here in Berlin on December 9th, and on moral accountability in the same city on December 10th. He then traveled to Bremen, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Cologne, and München, where he preached on or gave sohbets, conversations. At each site, he interacted with people who had been inspired by him, and with some who were simply curious about the Turkish celebrity who was in town. Gülen flew back to Izmir on December 16th. This was earlier than his original itinerary had anticipated. The trip did not go as expected. Some Turks connected to political Islamic currents in Turkey raised objections to Gülen's presence in Germany, and Gülen did not relish confrontation. The preacher from Erzurum was also homesick. As he put it, I had never been apart from Turkey and my friends for so long. Despite having been homesick, Gülen had enjoyed his tour to Germany, and it bore fruit with long-ranging significance for the Hizmet movement. Although there was friction, there were also ready audiences in nearly every city for his orthodox yet modern Islam, a hybrid that matched the experience of many Turks who had migrated to Germany since the 1960s, some in the audience tonight. Word of the crying Hoja had circulated among these Turkish expats, so Gülen had been welcomed with crowds, if not with friends, wherever he spoke. He encouraged these Turks to take a middle way, to integrate into German society, and to practice their Islam robustly and peacefully. Reflecting in later years on the opportunities he had to travel abroad, several more trips were coming in the 1980s and 90s, including a definitive one to the U.S. in 1999. Gülen observed that, quote, "By visiting the States and many European countries, I realized the virtues of and the role of religion in these societies. Islam flourishes in America and in Europe better than in many Muslim countries. This means freedom and the rule of law are necessary for personal Islam. Moreover, Islam does not need the state to survive, but rather needs educated and financially rich communities to flourish. In a way, not the state, but rather community is needed for a fully democratic system," end quote. What I call engaged empathy was how Fethullah Gülen took his awareness of suffering, of the way Muslims had fallen behind, and translated that into practical action as servants of God to alleviate suffering insofar as possible. Following again Sayyid Nursi, Gülen posited 3 causes of suffering as the most severe problems in the world: ignorance, poverty, or disunity and violence. Within the next decade, people inspired by Gülen would build schools to end ignorance, generate wealth through countless social businesses to end poverty, and sponsor interreligious dialogues to overcome disunity and violence. 2 more chapters. Still with me? Okay, thanks. Chapter 4 then concentrates especially on dialogue, for which Gülen and Hizmet became well known. One of the residences that Gülen lived in for 6 years when he was prohibited from preaching, known to close associates and friends, was a small apartment in a modest concrete flat in the Altunizade neighborhood of the Üsküdar district on the Asian side of Istanbul. And that's about as many Turkish cities as I could string together in one sentence. It was a Hizmet dormitory built with rooms for teaching along with rooms for students. Gülen's room was on the 5th floor. And that designation, the 5th floor, soon became a metaphor for how in Gülen's life and work, the melancholy of Istanbul, described so beautifully by Orhan Pamuk, the melancholy of Istanbul turned into both a deep personal peace and an expanding network of people that came to be called throughout Turkey, in fact, the Jemaat, the community. That community was dedicated to literacy, to nonviolence, and to engaged empathy. But during Gülen's years in Istanbul, he also became known for his commitment to interfaith dialogue and to a Turkish word often found in his preaching and teaching that has generally been translated as tolerance, but that really means more than that tepid term can convey. That word is hoşgörü. My understanding of hoşgörü is something like principled pluralism. A person committed to hoşgörü lives with integrity in one's own tradition, hence principled, but also lets others live out their deepest commitments that might differ dramatically from one's own, hence pluralism. But principled pluralism, or hoşgörü, as practiced and preached by Gülen and lived out in Hizmet, was not mere relativism. Instead, principled pluralism of hoşgörü in Hizmet wagered that Islam provided a foundation from which differences could be engaged and turned to cooperation through dialogue. A quote that Gülen often cites from Said Nursi, again, makes the point, quote, "Victory among civilized persons is won through persuasion," end quote. That is, when people of Hizmet met across differences, they did so on a basis of mutual respect. Knowing where one stood as a Muslim made it possible to accept differences without judgment, and surely without violence. Differences then created conditions for dialogue, and dialogue helped people learn to live together with greater peace and justice than before. That's an academic definition of hoşgörü then, as principled pluralism. But hoşgörü also meant, as Dr. Scott Alexander taught me, theologically, to see another as God sees them. And God sees above all with eyes of mercy and compassion. It was with this God's eye aspect of hoşgörü, as articulated by Fethullah Gülen, that led so many people of Hizmet in the 1990s to invite people from diverse cultures and communities into their community. During his years in Istanbul, then, Fethullah Gülen turned the melancholy of hüzün into hoşgörü through Hizmet. Large public dialogue events became signatures of the Gülen community, with Gülen often as keynote speaker or increasingly as honorary chair. These events, sometimes sponsored by the think tank Journalists and Writers Foundation, drew cross currents of Istanbul's business, artistic, and political elite to places like the posh Renaissance Polat Hotel, where on November 11, 1995, more than 1,000 gathered for an iftar dinner where Gülen spoke on, you guessed it, hoşgörü. These events continue now all over the world. It was an iftar dinner in Philadelphia in 2006 that first brought me into contact with the movement. Chapter 5, then, the final chapter, Hizmet Global, America, 1990 to the present, documents both the continued growth of Hizmet to every continent and the emergence of troubles between Hizmet and the Turkish government beginning in 2013. I've already said enough about the latter, so in my remaining remarks I'll concentrate on what I call in the book the DNA of Hizmet. Gülen's teaching regarding istişare, mutual consultation. From the very beginning of his teaching, Gülen taught that every person has dignity and voice. Nobody is intrinsically better than any other. This teaching became the heart of a deliberative style of organizing where people learned to trust themselves and each other. Gülen describes istişare as follows, quote, "For the Muslims of today, consultation is a vital attribute and an essential rule, just as it was for the first Muslims. According to the Quran, istişare is the clearest sign of a believing community. The importance of consultation is mentioned in the Quran to the same degree as salat, prescribed prayers," end quote. Given this importance, quote, "the most intelligent person is the one who most makes use of consultation and deliberation and who benefits most from the ideas of others," end quote. Finally, then, in consultation, quote, "neither seniority, nor title, nor status, nor being a personage of esteem can be a factor for making another person's opinion more credible. On the contrary, when the truth has become manifest in any consultation, Giving weight to these other factors can destroy the spirit of the consultation, end quote. Hizmet grew because consultation discovered differences, promoted debate, and taught people to trust themselves and others. People inspired by Gülen learned by making mistakes, adjusting accordingly, and trying again. That resilience has been the key to surviving the many efforts made first by secular authorities and now by political Islamists like the Turkish dictator to undermine Hizmet's efforts in education, social business, and dialogue. And so I conclude the biography of this remarkable man and the movement he inspired as follows. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of Fethullah Gülen's biography, and by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated, and those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, in fact, as Gülen wrote, eyes on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation. I'm now quoting him. Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. The springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly, according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview, and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. Yes, this springtime will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing, end quote. In a winter of brutal strong men, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian. Nothing more than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing Fethullah Gülen really knew how to do, it was to pray. So when he also encouraged people that difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been proved in Fethullah Gülen's life, almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gülen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korucuk was now a frail, old man. And yet Fethullah Gülen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by the brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven, he believed in resurrection, he believed in justice. His horizon was eternal. And so the end of Fethullah Gülen's life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gülen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you once again for the invitation to be with you, for your attention. I look forward to your questions.